This is apropos. It's his first official foreign trip since being sworn in last Friday. Mark Carney's decision to visit Paris instead of Washington, as is usual for Canadian leaders, comes after Donald Trump escalated trade tensions with both Ottawa and Brussels and floated threats of annexing Canada. The former central banker later travelled to London to meet Canada's head of state, King Charles, and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. James Vazina has more.
Sworn in on Friday, Mark Carney has already crossed the Atlantic. A heavy indication of the urgency for Canada's new government to have the country's long-term allies stand alongside it. That was confirmed when he said that the alliance between Canada and France is more important than ever.
With you, Mr. President, I want to ensure that France and the whole of Europe works enthusiastically with Canada, the most European of non-European countries, determined like you to maintain the most positive possible relations with the United States. Canada is a reliable, trustworthy and strong partner of France, which shares our values and lives them through action during this age of economic and geopolitical crises.
Threats that have turned to reality for Canada after Donald Trump imposed tariffs at the start of March. Aluminium and steel entering the United States are subject to a 25% tariff, and he's threatened to widen them to all Canadian products at the beginning of next month. As the rift with the United States grows, Canada and France have committed to developing a new security and intelligence partnership. Carney's government is currently reconsidering the purchase of US-made fighter jets in light of the trade war.
Canada and France are powers for peace, reliable allies who will take part in this effort together. It is in this spirit that we will maintain our support for Ukraine and continue to demand clear commitments from Russia.
With Donald Trump repeatedly making comments about Canada becoming the United States' 51st state, it's the country's sovereignty that's also central to many Canadians' concerns.
So that's not going to happen anymore.
Carney said that the comments were disrespectful and need to stop.
Wait till Monday again, manufacturing jobs.
For more, we're joined now by Scott Lucas, Professor of US and International Politics at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Thanks so much for being with us this evening, Scott. So, Mark Carney's first overseas mission, as it were, what exactly prompted this trip? Is it simply because of the Trump factor, as one observer put it?
Well, I certainly think the Trump factor is part of this, but part of this is where Canada is vis-a-vis the United States versus Europe right now. And it is an important symbol that Mark Carney's first trip was not to Washington to see Donald Trump, but it was to see Keir Starmer in the UK and Emmanuel Macron in France. We have the immediate issue that Donald Trump does not see Canada as ally. He sees Canada as a territory to be bullied at the very least. And of course, if you take his statements at face value, Trump wants to take over Canada. Now, that's a great offense to Canadian nationalism. It's an offense to Canadian sovereignty, but it makes Canada rethink where its political and economic position is. And if the United States is not going to be your ally, who will be? And that's why you have this reach out to the UK, to France, and more broadly to the European Union. And I think one thing I found striking this week is that if you ask Canadians who they favor, 68% have a favorable view of the EU versus 34% of the United States. That's a stunning shift. And by the way, almost half of Canadians now actually favor joining the European Union, even though I don't think that's on the cards in the near future.
And Canada also, Scott, it's reviewing the purchase of American-made F-35 fighter jets in light of Trump's trade war. Carney's suggesting a little earlier that alternative aircraft could be built in Canada or perhaps in Europe. Is that likely, do you think, at this stage?
Well, I think the immediate alternative for Canada is that when they considered where to buy the fighter jets, the F-35 came out first, but Sweden's Saab Gripen came out second. And that's an immediate option. They can go to the Swedes and get those jets while they consider trying to build up a domestic capability. But remember, you also have other alternatives, such as the Eurofighter. And indeed, this is not just Canada. Portugal has said, the Portuguese defense minister has said that Portugal is considering pulling out of contracts to buy the F-35, that it's looking at alternatives. There are indications that Germany may consider that as well. Again, I come back to a fundamental. For the first time in 84 years, since 1941, you have a US government which is not allied with Europe. It is not allied with Canada. And in that circumstance, Canada, Europe, and other countries look at each other and say, how do we build up these capabilities without necessarily going through Washington?
Yeah, because the French president also has been ramping up efforts to persuade allies to move away from purchasing those American military hardware. But Scott, the top 5 firms globally, they're all American. After that, it's kind of mostly followed by Chinese firms. In and around 27 of the top 100 are based in Europe. So can these alternative suppliers, can they actually ramp up production? And how long might that take?
This is a long-term project. Certainly there will be an effort to increase production capacity, but you're right, there are limits on that. But you're talking about developing the ability in the longer term to have a much greater capacity. I think what we are seeing is the potential for the greatest realignment of relationships around the world, including with the United States, since 1945. And what you're seeing, I think, is Canada, the European Union, including France and other countries, finally taking a look 5, 10, 15 years down the road and saying we have to make these plans. We cannot, as we have done in the past, make the assumption of a US-led NATO, a US-led transatlantic relationship. So what you're seeing is certainly not something that will fill the gap that the US has provided in security for more than 80 years, but it is a start, and it's an indication that this may finally be a world which is one in which the United States is not necessarily at the center of where France, Canada, or other countries go next.
And that clearly the message that Mark Carney is trying to send. He's no stranger, of course, to London. Is it a difficult balancing act, do you believe, for the likes of France and the UK to show their solidarity with the new Canadian Prime Minister without, irritating too much the White House?
I think we're beyond balancing acts. I mean, think about Mark Carney. Not only is he Prime Minister of Canada, but he was Governor of the Bank of England when you had the other major shock of recent years, which is the UK leaving the European Union. Now, in the aftermath of the UK leaving the European Union, EU countries have had to reconsider their relationships. And now I think you have to be at a point where your first thought is not what is Donald Trump's ego, not will Donald Trump humiliate you in public. You have to think about your national interest first. Because if you simply think of Trump first, you put yourself on the defensive. You don't plan, you react. And I think Mark Carney, Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, and other leaders are saying, we cannot just react now. We have to act, we have to plan, not only for the sake of our countries, but remember for the sake of Ukraine as it faces a Russian invasion, an invasion in which Donald Trump may have more sympathy with Vladimir Putin than with Ukraine's fight to survive.
And they have to act, they have to plan, as you say, Scott. But what do you think, in terms of concrete proposals, is going to actually come out of those meetings today, firstly in Paris and then later on in London?
Well, I think you have a wider context here, first of all, which is that which came out last week in the aftermath of the humiliation, the attempted humiliation of Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, by the White House. Ursula von der Leyen saying, our goal as the European Union is 800 billion euros in investment in our defense industry and defense production. You have Canada, which is saying we have to ramp up with billions of Canadian dollars into our own security establishment. Now, it is not just a question of spending money on that. You also have to develop the logistics chains. You have to coordinate between various defense firms. You have to coordinate production cycles. But I think, again, I have to emphasize for the first time, really, that I can remember, you have Canadian and European countries saying, we're going to plan for this defense without assuming that the United States is at the center of this. And this will take place, by the way, not only in terms of the national level, it will also take place within NATO as well, which means we may have a far different NATO than the one that we've been accustomed to in recent years.
And these meetings, of course, happening, we've been talking about it here this evening before this scheduled call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, really Europe being forced to take a backseat in all of this, isn't it? Despite these meetings and these continual shows of solidarity between various EU leaders and now with the new Canadian Prime Minister.
Well, I think it's a contest, and I think it's revealing what actually happened in the just over 2 weeks after that attempted humiliation of Vladimir Zelensky. That was on a Friday. On the Monday, the European Union, including Ursula von der Leyen's statement, was to step up and say, all right, we're not going to sit by and let this happen. First, we're going to increase defense production. Secondly, we're going to look at our own security guarantees for Ukraine, something which has been led by Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer. And third, we're going to develop an alternative negotiating path to the US-Russia direct talks. Now, here we are just over 2 weeks later, and we have had that commitment to increase defense production. More importantly, we've had discussion of security guarantees, which are proceeding with talks on Thursday amongst military leaders. And we have had this Ukraine-US ceasefire plan, which was brokered by the Europeans. In other words, what we saw was that Europe stepping up actually put Vladimir Putin on the defensive. And the reason why he is finally granting that call to Donald Trump, something he has dangled before Trump for weeks, is so the Kremlin can try to regain the initiative by spinning Trump, by flipping him to try to undermine the ceasefire proposal. That again means that Europe again will have to respond if Trump does follow Putin's lead and reach out to those Americans within the Trump administration who still think Ukraine's security is something worth defending.
Scott, as ever, thanks so much for being with us on the programme this evening, for all your analysis there. That's Scott Lucas, Professor of US and International Politics at the Clinton Institute at UCD Dublin. Well, that's it from us for now. Do stay with us, though. We'll be back shortly with more world news.